Happy Tuesday, family. Welcome back. And before we get into anything else, I genuinely hope you had an amazing Easter. The kind with good food and good people, and maybe, if you were lucky, a moment or two of the kind of quiet that reminds you why you do any of this in the first place. Prince Harry is sitting in rooms that most people don't even know exist. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech designed to suggest importance through vagueness, literally. There are rooms, working rooms, functional rooms, rooms where the agenda is not ceremony or tradition or the careful management of institutional appearances, but actual substantive engagement with actual consequential questions where conversations are happening right now that will shape the world that all of us, and more importantly, all of our children, are going to inhabit for the foreseeable future. Conversations about data, about privacy, about the architecture of the digital environment that most of humanity now spends a significant portion of its waking life inside. About who built that architecture and who it was built for, and whose interests it actually serves, and what the consequences have been and what they will continue to be if the current trajectory doesn't change. These are not abstract conversations. They are not theoretical exercises happening in academic journals that nobody reads outside the specific field. They are practical, urgent, high-stakes discussions being had by people who are actively working to shape policy and regulation and the behavioral standards of the most powerful technology companies on the planet. And Prince Harry is in those rooms. Last week in Washington, D.C., he attended a workshop, a real, working, roll-up-your-sleeves workshop, not a gala, not a ceremonial appearance, not a moment designed to produce a photograph, hosted by Archwell in partnership with the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Let's be precise about what that organization is, because the name matters and it tends to get glossed over in the rush to the next thing. The International Association of Privacy Professionals is the world's largest and most widely recognized organization dedicated to the privacy profession. Its members work across government, technology companies, legal firms, advocacy organizations, and academic institutions in more than 100 countries. When the IAPP convenes something, it is not a symbolic gesture. It is a gathering of people with actual decision-making power and actual technical expertise in fields that are currently among the most consequential in the world. This was not a photo opportunity. This was Harry choosing to be part of a serious, substantive, professionally significant conversation, choosing to show up not as a figurehead lending his name to a worthy cause from a comfortable distance, but as an active, engaged participant in working discussions about issues that he clearly understands, clearly cares about, and clearly has something meaningful to contribute to. And the room he showed up to? 60 young leaders, people in the early stages of careers in data protection, artificial intelligence, digital policy, online safety, and AI ethics. People who are, right now, building the knowledge and developing the skills that will allow them to work on the problems that are going to define the next several decades of human experience with technology. These are not the people who built the current system. These are the people who are going to have to live with its consequences, navigate its failures, and figure out how to build something better. And Harry sat with them. Not on a stage above them, not at a podium delivering a prepared speech before being ushered out to the next commitment. He sat with them in roundtable discussions, contributing, listening, engaging with the substance of what they were working on, treating their expertise with the respect it deserves, and treating the conversations as the serious, consequential exchanges they actually are. That is worth stopping and acknowledging, because it is genuinely rare, even among people who claim dedication to causes, who lend their names and their platforms to important work, the willingness to show up for the unglamorous parts, the working sessions, the roundtables, the conversations that don't produce great photographs but do produce real progress, is considerably less common than the willingness to show up for the ceremonial ones. Harry showed up for the working session. Now let's talk about what was actually being discussed in that room. Because the content of the conversation is as important as the fact of Harry's presence in it, and it deserves to be laid out clearly rather than gestured at vaguely. The theme of the workshop was captured in a phrase that sounds almost deceptively simple: leading with humanity in a digital world. Simple, yes, but unpack it for even a moment and the depth becomes apparent. Because embedded in that phrase is a diagnosis, an aspiration, and a challenge all at once. The diagnosis: the digital world, as currently constructed, is not leading with humanity, is not built around human flourishing, human dignity, human well-being, or human needs in any genuine structural sense, is built, instead, around something else entirely. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of every serious conversation about the technology environment we now inhabit, and that the technology industry has spent considerable resources over many years trying to keep from being stated too plainly. Your attention is a product. Your data is a currency. Your behavior, your clicks, your pauses, your reactions, your emotional responses, your purchases, your relationships, your anxieties, your desires, is being tracked, analyzed, modeled, and used to shape what you see, what you feel, and how you act. Not occasionally, not in limited ways, comprehensively, continuously, with a sophistication that most people have no real conceptual framework for understanding because it operates invisibly, beneath the surface of experiences that feel like choices, but are in many cases the predictable outputs of systems designed to produce them. The algorithm that decides what you see on any given platform is not a neutral tool delivering you information you might find useful. It is an optimization engine built to maximize a specific metric, typically engagement, typically measured in time spent and emotional reactivity, that has no structural obligation to care whether the content driving that engagement is true, healthy, or good for you in any meaningful sense. In fact, the research is increasingly clear that some of the content most effective at driving engagement is the content most damaging to individual and collective well-being. Outrage is more engaging than calm. Conflict is more engaging than agreement. Fear is more engaging than safety. Comparison is more engaging than contentment. So the system, optimized for engagement, feeds us more outrage, more conflict, more fear, more comparison. Not because anyone made a specific conscious malicious decision to harm us, because the system was built to maximize a metric, and maximizing that metric turns out to produce harm as a byproduct. And the people in that room, the young privacy professionals and AI ethicists and digital policy specialists that Harry sat with last week, are the people working to change that, to redesign the relationship between technology and humanity so that human well-being is a structural feature rather than an afterthought, to create frameworks for accountability that don't depend on the goodwill of companies whose financial interests are served by the current arrangement. This is the conversation Harry was part of. This is the work he has chosen to invest in, and this is why the work is disruptive in the most literal sense. It directly challenges the architecture of systems that are enormously profitable for enormously powerful entities, and it does so not through protest or publicity, but through the slow, serious, unglamorous work of building the expertise, the policy frameworks, and the professional culture that make change actually possible. Here is where Harry's personal history becomes not just relevant, but essential to understanding why his presence in these spaces carries a weight it wouldn't carry for most people. He grew up in a system where privacy was not a right, but a negotiation, where the line between public interest and personal intrusion was not drawn by any principle, but by whatever a particular editor decided was commercially advantageous on a particular day, where his life, his grief, his relationships, his struggles, his mistakes, his private moments was considered fair game for consumption by an industry that had no structural obligation to treat him as a full human being rather than a source of content. He has spoken about this, at length in ways that were painful to deliver and that required a kind of courage that tends to be underestimated because it looks from the outside like the act of a person with a platform choosing to use it. But speaking the truth about your own experience in public in the face of an industry that has enormous power and demonstrated willingness to punish those who challenge it, that is not a comfortable or costless thing to do. And what he has said, consistently and across multiple contexts, is that the harm he experienced was not incidental or exceptional, was not the product of a few bad actors operating outside normal industry standards, was the predictable output of a system designed to monetize attention without accountability, to treat human beings as raw material for content without meaningful consideration of the consequences. He has seen what that system produces at its worst. He has lived in the blast radius of it. And now he is trying to prevent the next generation, digital natives growing up in an environment that is, in many ways, a more powerful and more pervasive version of the same fundamental dynamic, from experiencing the same. When Harry talks about digital harm in those rooms, he's not speaking as a theorist. He is speaking as someone who understands, from the inside, from direct and sustained personal experience, what it feels like to have your life mediated by systems that don't see you as a person, to have your narrative constructed by forces you have no meaningful power to influence, to watch the gap between who you actually are and who the machinery says you are widen to the point where the machinery's version achieves its own independent life. That experience doesn't just make him a compelling advocate. It makes him a specific kind of expert, the kind whose knowledge isn't in books or research papers, but in lived reality. And that kind of knowledge, in conversations about the human consequences of system design, is not supplementary to the technical expertise in the room. It is essential to it. And Megan is part of this, fully, substantively, consequentially part of it. Even when she isn't physically in a specific room, even when a particular event focuses on Harry's presence rather than hers, because the work of Archwell, the foundation they built together, that they have continued to build with consistency and seriousness through years of circumstance that would have provided ample justification for stepping back, is not a collection of individual moments. It is not a series of disconnected appearances at worthy events. It is a program, a coherent, strategic, long-term investment in specific areas of work that they have identified as both genuinely important and genuinely underserved. Mental health, online safety, responsible technology, supporting communities that have been underserved by existing systems, building infrastructure for accountability in spaces where accountability has been structurally absent. These are not causes selected for their PR value. These are not the kind of issues that generate the most immediate, most visible, most easily photographed wins. These are the hard, slow, unsexy areas of work where progress is measured in years and sometimes decades, and where the people doing the most important work are often the least recognized for it. Megan's sustained focus on these areas, her consistent, specific, substantive engagement with the human consequences of online harm, with the particular vulnerability of young people in digital environments, with the gap between what our technology systems do and what they should do, represents a body of advocacy work that deserves to be assessed on its merits rather than filtered through the distorting lens of how it's been covered. She has been in those rooms too. Different rooms, different conversations, the same fundamental commitment. And together, what they are building through Archwell is something that operates on a different logic than the traditional celebrity cause association. Something that takes the long view, something that is willing to do the unglamorous work because the unglamorous work is where the actual change happens. Let's address the question that this entire situation inevitably raises, because it's the right question and it deserves a direct answer. Why isn't this getting more coverage? Why, when Prince Harry is participating in serious, substantive, professionally significant work on issues that affect every person who uses the internet, which is to say, nearly everyone on the planet, is that work not receiving the sustained, prominent, investigative attention it deserves? The answer is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. Because there's no scandal in it. Because there's no angle that fits the narrative. Because covering this work seriously would require engaging with its substance, with the actual content of the conversations, with the actual significance of the organizations involved, with the actual complexity of the issues being addressed. And there is another layer to this that goes beyond laziness or narrative inertia. Covering this work seriously would mean asking uncomfortable questions about the very industry doing the covering. Because the issues Harry was discussing in that Washington, D.C. workshop, privacy, data exploitation, the accountability of powerful platforms, the consequences of systems designed to prioritize engagement over well-being, are not issues that exist at a comfortable remove from media organizations. They are issues that implicate media organizations directly, that raise questions about the data practices of digital publishers, that challenge the engagement optimization logic that drives content decisions across the industry, that point toward a reckoning with the relationship between media business models and the human consequences of those models. Covering Harry's work in this space seriously, thoroughly, and honestly would require a level of self-examination that most media institutions are not currently structured to perform. So instead, we get silence. Or we get the work reduced to a brief, decontextualized mention that doesn't give the audience the information they need to understand what it actually is or why it actually matters. And the work continues anyway, quietly, consistently, with the particular patience of people who have decided that the measure of their effort is not how much coverage it generates, but how much impact it creates. There is something worth sitting with about the young leaders who were in that room. 60 people, early in careers that are genuinely pioneering, in fields that are defining the parameters of how billions of human beings will experience their own lives for generations to come. People who chose these fields not because they are the most immediately lucrative or the most socially prestigious, but because they understood, with a clarity that speaks well of them, that the questions being asked in data protection and AI ethics and digital rights are among the most important questions of our time. These are not people who need a famous person in the room to validate their work. Their work validates itself. The problems they are working on are real and urgent and consequential, regardless of who shows up to discuss them. But there is something that Harry's presence in that room represented that goes beyond endorsement. It represented the idea that these conversations, technical, policy-focused, unglamorous, operating far from the spotlight, are worth the time of someone who could be doing anything. Someone with a name that opens doors and a platform that reaches millions, and no institutional obligation to spend his time in working sessions with privacy professionals in Washington, D.C. He chose to be there. Not because it was strategic, not because a communications team identified it as optimal for his public image, because the work matters to him, because the issues are personal, because sitting with 60 young people who are trying to build a more humane digital world is exactly the kind of thing he wants to be doing with the freedom and the platform and the lived experience he has. That choice is a statement about what leadership looks like when it isn't tied to a title, about what impact looks like when it isn't measured by applause, about what legacy looks like when it's built not through tradition, but through genuine, sustained, consequential contribution to the problems that actually need solving. Here is where this lands. There is a version of Harry's story that has been told loudly and at great length in certain spaces, a version that is familiar and repeatable, and that has been refined through years of use into something that functions almost automatically, that requires no new information and no new thinking to produce because it was completed long ago and just needs to be replayed. And then there is the actual story. The one happening in working rooms in Washington, D.C., in roundtable discussions with privacy professionals and AI ethicists, and the young people who are going to shape the digital future. In the ongoing serious, substantive work of an organization that was built not for headlines, but for impact. The actual story is about a man who took the freedom he fought for at enormous personal cost and chose to use it in service of something that matters, who brought his lived experience of being harmed by systems without accountability into rooms where people are working to build accountability into systems, who decided that the most meaningful thing he could do with his particular combination of access and experience and platform was to show up consistently and seriously for the unglamorous work of making the world better for the people who are going to inherit it. That story doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't produce outrage or scandal or the kind of content that the machine runs on. It just produces change. Slowly, deliberately, in rooms that most people don't know exist, with 60 young leaders who will carry those conversations into careers that will shape the digital world for decades to come, and a prince who decided his legacy would be measured not by the ceremonies he attended, but by the futures he helped build. That's the story. And now you know it. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and take care.